Imagine stepping out into a cold, dark, damp street. Your sense of vision blurred by the thick, dense fog. You notice the street lights are poorly lit, but guess what? You carry on walking on your journey's way, when all of a sudden you hear those footsteps coming up behind you. And no matter how fast you walk, them footsteps, they keep creeping up on you. And now as your terror and fear takes over, you feel the sharp impending doom become even more excruciatingly painful. This is the terrifying case and horrible crimes of Jack the Ripper. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Wherever you may be in the world right now, hello, I'm Lloyd, and today you're watching When Evil Follows, the Halloween special. The year is 1888, and London at this time was known for its trade in commodities for many people in Europe, and so an explosion of immigrants from all around the world would come to London in search of work, a new life and a beautiful future for themselves and their families. The London city walls would soon begin to split and crack as social and financial struggles would bleed into the very heart of the city, as London became overpopulated with far too many people all looking for work, and all looking to find their own way in this ongoing maze of poverty, crime, dirty streets, and even human feces. And yes, it's true to say that back then in 1888, the East End of London was nothing more than, well, in most parts, was nothing more than a filthy and dirty, disgusting slum. Thick fog would fall gently, settling down on the ground, near grass fields, damp roads, wet sidewalks, and even in the back alleys. And the smog. The smog in London back then was so potent in the air, making it almost unbearable to breathe at times. And with both the fog and smog together, this would make visibility quite difficult, especially in the evenings. The crime rates in London's East End was super high, and back then in 1888, criminal activity would often commonly occur and escalate, starting with drunks, urinating in the street, people fighting, prostitution, and even murder. Women would also perform sexual acts on men in the streets and also in the back alleyways. There was also quite a lot of racial aggravation and fighting in the streets because of the land commoners. The local commoners believed that the foreigners were to blame for the overcrowding of the city, leading to a lack of work, money, and poor living conditions. Now, prostitution was rife, and for many women they would really struggle and find it hard enough to keep money in their pocket to pay for a roof over their head and for their loved ones. And so for many women, they would work the streets, selling their bodies as the only way they could make money. Burglary, theft and violence would lurk long into the early hours of the morning, awaiting in search for anybody walking the streets alone. And so if a person was drunk or seemed to be lost, young or old, male or female, alone, walking the dark streets of Whitechapel at night, then you were vulnerable to any kind of criminal violence. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the street lighting was very poorly lit in the East End of London, and so it wasn't uncommon to see the homeless and gin-drinking alcoholics and other unsettling figures moving around in the street shadows. Bearing in mind, policing in 1888 was still in its infancy, meaning no DNA, no fingerprints, no finger pressing, no networking, no radio communication, no social profiling, no CCTV, as we know today. Policing the streets of London back then was often a dark and scary career to be carrying. The police would often walk the dark streets alone into the early hours of the morning, with only a small heavy wooden truncheon and a blowpiece whistle, only to be used when making an arrest. The local parish of Whitechapel's London's East End became increasingly overpopulated, with the population increasing to approximately 85,000 inhabitants by the year of 1888. And as the lack of work and housing conditions worsened, the pressures gave many women no choice but to take to the streets in order to sell their bodies to make money. Mary Ann Walker. She was born in Dean Street, London on the 26th of August in the year of 1845. Mary was only 5 foot 2 inches tall. She had brown eyes, brown hair and high cheekbones, and she was known to many back then as Polly. Mary was the second born of 3 children to Mr. Edward Walker, a locksmith who would later change his career and become a successful blacksmith. Now Mary would find love and she would later marry into the Nicholas family. And on the 16th of January in the year of 1864 at St. Bride's Parish Church in the East End of London, her happy life together with Mr. Nichols would be shortly lived, and sadly her marriage would soon come to an end, leaving Mary with an unstable cost of living and vulnerable. She started drinking. In fact, she started drinking a lot. She became a heavy drinker. And so Mary would take to the streets to sell her body. Clearly hard times would follow Mary as she quickly became known to the police for crimes on prostitution, drinking and disorderly, and also breaching the peace. On the 31st of August in the year of 1888, Mary Ann Nichols, just aged 43, would be found dead at the Gate Stable entrance on Bucks Row in Whitechapel in London. Her body was actually discovered by a horse and cart man named Charles Allen Cross. He actually told the police that at first glance he actually believed that he was looking at some sort of trumpet case that was left at the side of the road in front of the stable gates. And so when he went over to take a closer look, only to discover it was a woman's body just laying on the ground. Mary was laying on her back, and her arms and legs were straight by her side, and her long skirt was raised up above her knees. Her eyes were open, and her face was still warm to the touch. During her post-mortem, they discovered that both sides of her face were badly bruised by being punched in the face over and over, and they also found strangulation thumb marks around her throat. They also found 2 deep knife wounds on her body, measuring 8 inches in length and 4 inches across. Both wounds were so deep that the blade actually cut through all layers of flesh straight to the bone, leaving knife marks on the spinal cord. Several incisions had also been inflicted across her bottom stomach, this actually causing her bowels to protrude through her wounds. And 3 or 4 similar cuts went down the right side of her body as well. These cuts had all been inflicted by the same knife, and the estimated size of the blade was believed to be between 7 and 9 inches long. Her wounds were also inflicted in a violent and downwards thrusting manner. However, due to the stab wounds and marks found on the body, the police believed the killer to have some sort of clinical knowledge of the human body and could potentially be well educated. Other than that, the police had no new leads. Anne was born Eliza Ann Smith on the 25th of September in the year of 1840. She was the first of 5 children born and had a relatively normal upbringing. Annie, now a grown woman, would find love and support on the 1st of May in the year of 1869. Annie would go on to marry John James Chapman, who, by the way, was related to Annie's mother. Annie and John would eventually go on to have 3 children, Emily Ruth, Annie Georgia and John Alfred. The marriage, however, wasn't that great and would come to an end as both John and Annie would separate by mutual consent in 1884. Sadly, after the divorce, Annie would lose custody of her daughter, and this would lead her to unhealthy drinking. Now, according to her family reports, Annie did enjoy a good drink when she was younger, and that's when she developed a weakness for alcohol. Annie's family would support her and would even beg her to refrain from drinking alcohol, but despite the family's best efforts to help her, Annie would fall over and again and again. And now, with no husband to support her financially and support her lifestyle, Annie would soon turn to the streets as a working girl in order to feed her drinking habit. Sadly, on the 8th of September in the year of 1888, Annie Chapman's mutilated body would be discovered at 6 p.m. by an elderly resident on Hannonbury Street, London, in Whitechapel. Her body was found laying on the ground near the back doorway to the backyard. In fact, her head was less than 6 inches away from the steps to someone's homely property. The police sent Annie's body off for a full post-mortem, and they would quickly discover that Annie had suffered 2 severe, deep slash wounds to her throat. Both slash wounds were made from the left to the right across the front of her neck. Both cuts were between 5 to 6 inches across and were measured at 3 inches deep. Annie's body was totally mutilated. Her belly also had several incisions going across the front of her stomach, causing her bowels to pour out of her wounds. There was also 4 similar cuts running down the right side of her body. These cuts were estimated to be at least 4 to 7 inches and were made with a downwards thrusting manner. And it's true to say these stab wounds found on Annie's body, along with the several bruises on her face, was almost identical to the injuries discovered on Annie Nichols's body, the Ripper's first victim. Elizabeth Stride, she was born on the 27th of November in the year of 1843 in Sweden. She was the second of 4 children born, and she was raised in a small quiet village farm. She would often help out on the farm doing jobs, helping her father, and she would also spend time with her mother in the kitchen, helping her with the pots. In February of 1866, Elizabeth moved to London. Her actual reasons for why she relocated from Sweden to England is unknown. Upon her arrival living in London, Elizabeth learned to speak English in addition to her native language, and she also had a relationship with an East End London police officer. Well, that was until Elizabeth found real love in a man called John Thomas. Elizabeth and John would be married at St Giles Church and would go on to bear no children, and by 1874 the Strides' love in marriage was quickly deteriorating. Although the couple would still continue to live together for the next couple of years at least, purely because London living conditions were just so poor. They were bad. However, in the March of 1877, Elizabeth was admitted into working in a popular women's workhouse, which strongly suggests that the couple had definitely separated by this time. Now, it was on the 30th of September 1888 at approximately 1 AM in Duffetfield Yard where Elizabeth Strand's body would be discovered. Her body was laying on its side facing the street wall, away from the roadside, with her face, arms, legs and hands all showing severe discoloration. Her neck was deeply cut open and her wounds were almost 6 inches in length and almost 3 inches deep. This would mean that Stride would have died a very painful death. Elizabeth's body wasn't gutted out and hacked up like the other victims, suggesting that the Ripper heard heavy footsteps coming closer to where he was, quite possibly interrupting his killing. Maybe a police officer doing his nightly rounds in that particular part of the city perhaps. Or maybe someone who lived local nearby returning home after a long day's work. However, due to the circumstances of how Elizabeth's body was left and found, it's highly likely that the killer was almost indeed definitely disturbed. And without the time for accurately disembowelling the body, just like he did all the other victims, this overwhelming sense to kill wasn't fulfilled. And so in less than just 1 hour after Elizabeth Stride's body was discovered, the police would yet go on to find another woman's mutilated body on the same night and less than a mile away. Police Officer Watkins, he was making his regular rounds walking through the Whitechapel area as normal when he discovered a totally terrifying and gruesome discovery. PC Watkins found a mutilated and disemboweled body of a 46-year-old woman known to everybody as Catherine Eddowes. She was a prostitute from the Whitechapel area who worked the streets regularly in order to make money. Catherine's body was found even more mutilated than any of the other Jack the Ripper victims. In fact, Catherine's body would be found face down on the ground, laying in a pool of her own blood. And her body was savagely cut open from the top of the breast all the way down to the pelvis. Her intestines had then been pulled out and ripped away from the body and then placed over her left shoulder. And then her kidneys were then taken out and removed completely away from the rest of her body. Catherine's uterus was also surgically removed, cleanly and carefully. The police had also noticed that Catherine's killer had left cuts over her eyes, making crosses. She literally had crossing cuts over both of her eyes. And even more sicker if possible, he then cut off her nose. He cut her neck so deeply that the head of the body was almost decapitated. I can't even imagine the last moments Catherine would have been subjected to, or the horror PC Watkins would have felt finding the body just left that way. Mary Jane Kelly was born in the year of 1863, and she was born in Limerick in Ireland. Her family would eventually move to Wales, and it would be in Wales when a young Mary Jane Kelly would find love. In fact, she was only 16 years old when she got married to a man called Davis. However, only 3 years later, she would become a widow. Sadly, her newly husband was killed at work during a mining explosion. Mary Jane Kelly, now carrying a broken heart, decided to start a new life in Cardiff. Although it is believed to be around this time in her life that things wasn't going too well for her, and she somehow managed to get tied up in the world of prostitution with no man to love or support her and help her. Life would become much more difficult, and so once again, not happy with life, she packs up all her things into a bag and she heads off to London for a new beginning. Mary would find love with a man named Joseph Barnett, a man who sells fruit and vegetables, and they would happily live together in a lodge house on George Street in London. By the March in 1888, the couple were living at 13 Miller's Court, Dorset Street, which was basically just a small little partially furnished room. The landlord at the time was John McCartney, who would always be very demanding and would become quite violent if the rent wasn't paid on time. And it was in the late summer of 1888 the couple's relatively stable life was interrupted when Joseph lost his job. And as a result of him losing work, Mary would have to take to the streets once again in order to make money to pay the rent. Under the pressures, the pair would begin arguing and drinking. And during these arguments, whilst drinking, the pair became quite violent towards each other. This one occasion, whilst drunk and in a temper, Mary threw something at Joseph. She missed him, and the item went crashing through the window. And it was soon after this incident Joseph had enough. He packed his bags and he moved out. Now, despite their separation, the pair did remain close friends, and Joseph continued helping Mary financially whenever he could and whenever it was possible for him to do so. However, on the evening of the 8th of November in the year of 1888, Joseph would visit Mary Jane Kelly for the last time. Mary's body was laying naked in the middle of the bed. Her shoulders were flat and her head was turned into her left cheek. Mary's left arm was resting next to her body, but her right arm was completely hacked off and then rested on the mattress at the other side of her body. Her legs were forced apart and the complete surface of her stomach and thighs were completely cut away, meaning that her stomach cavity was completely gutted out and both of her breasts were completely cut away from the rest of the body. The killer used circular incisions to remove both of her breasts. The lower left part of her lung was also just completely cut out and ripped away from the rest of her body. Both of her arms were also completely mutilated by 10 deep rip wounds, exposing most of her bones. The skin tissue and flesh around her neck was completely ripped and slashed away, all the way down and around to the bone. Her nose, her lips, her cheeks and eyebrows and even her ears were all cut away from her face. The killer then began to hack away and stab her face over and over and over until all recognition of her facial features were gone. Jack the Ripper then took out her uterus and kidneys. They were gone, completely removed. Can you imagine that? You've got a body laying on the bed, like the neck. There's no neck, it's just a bone. There's no arms, there's just a bone and all the flesh is gone. The stomach is completely emptied out, it's hollow. The uterus is gone, kidneys have gone, and he's not even finished yet. He's nowhere near finished. Not by a long shot. Jack the Ripper then removed Mary's intestines, just like he did all the other victims, and then he pulled them and ripped them and yanked them out of her body, and then finally he rested them over her right shoulder. Jack the Ripper then cuts away Mary's spleen and he pulls it and rips it away from what little of the body's left and then puts it on the mattress next to the detached arm. And on the floor beneath the bed was a pool of blood stretching 3 meters across the flooring. Most of Mary's bedclothing was ripped away from her body and then just shoved in the right corner of the room. Now the police by this time, they had absolutely nothing to go on. There was no physical items found believed to belong to the killer. No clothing, no sighting, no witnesses, no description. No nothing. However, the police were able to begin building some sort of character profile based on the wounds and marks that were left on the victims' bodies. The police at this time, after looking very closely at each one of the murder cases, and after studying all of the reports by the pathologists who carried out the post-mortems, they strongly believed that the killer had some kind of medical skill or a well knowledge of the human anatomy. And that's purely because whoever was removing the body parts, they did it quickly, cleanly, and they did it in the dark. And that's not an easy thing to do. Also bear in mind that these murders were done within a very quick time, because no killer wants to hang around at the scene of the crime, not really. And the police, they knew this, and so all this information only enforced the belief further that they were dealing with some kind of professional, someone like a medical doctor, or a surgeon, or even a butcher, someone who knows the streets of Whitechapel exceptionally well. And so this led police to believe that the killer was someone who was living locally, and that this person also knows all the little pathways leading in and out of the different areas of Whitechapel, allowing him to get from one area to another area much quicker than most, and that's why the killer was able to avoid detection. Now the police knew that all these little clues could eventually help unmask the killer's identity, and this gave police a starting point on where to start looking, and who to start looking for. Now over the years there have been many suspects believed to have been linked and of course capable of committing these murders. In fact, there have been well over 35 different people who have all been closely looked at by the police as a potential suspect in these horrific crimes. And these suspects would range from local barbaric communities leading right up to members of the royal family. I mean, there was just so many suspects. However, most of all these so-called criminals were cleared from all possibilities. But still, that doesn't stop people from speculating as to who they think the murderer was, even to this very day. Now, as I mentioned earlier, most of the suspects were cleared from suspicion and investigation, leaving us with a possible 3 criminal profile fitting suspects. Leather Apron was a Polish man of Jewish faith, and his name was John Pfizer, and he used to work in the Whitechapel area as a local hard-working bootmaker. John was actually really well known to the police for a string of violent crimes against women, mainly prostitutes. He was also charged on stabbing offences and was arrested for threatening to, quote, rip apart prostitutes. The press were really quick to nickname this suspect as Leather Apron, because he was always seen out and about in public wearing this long brown creepy leather apron. Back then I think the press believed that if John was the killer, then the leather apron would be the perfect protective clothing to wear whilst committing these horrendous crimes. However, Leather Apron was never charged with any of these horrific crimes due to having strong alibis on the date of the murders. John Pfizer died in the year of 1897, just aged 42. Another recent suspect is a German man from America called Karl Fagenborn. He was already responsible for 3 murders, 2 of which were prostitutes working the downtown streets in New York, and the 3rd victim was a landlord. Karl Fagenborn's first victim was a 60-year-old woman named Carly Brown, also known to many other street workers in the area as the Old Shakespeare. Her body would be found all mangled and mutilated, just like the murdered women in Whitechapel in London. And sadly, the same fate would await Julie Hoffman, a 56-year-old prostitute who was working the slums in New York. Shockingly, her body was also found completely mangled and mutilated, with the same cross marks cut into her face, over her eyelids, just like Catherine Eddowes. Now, what's the odds of that then? Eh? The police actually caught up with Karl Wagenberg in the act of killing his landlord, a stupid dispute over late payment of rent. In fact, he was just pulling out the blade from the victim's body just as the police were knocking down the door. And in pure shock, Karl dropped the knife onto the floor, which was now covered in blood, and then decided to flee the scene by jumping out the window. The police, however, were quick and brave in making the arrest and instantly put the cuffs on him. Karl confessed to all 3 killings by telling the police that he was infected with a mental disorder and he couldn't help himself, and he just felt compelled to kill, especially women who confronted him sexually. He also confessed to his lawyer, Mr. Norton, and his older brother John, that he was also responsible for 5 more murders in 1888 in Whitechapel, London. Carl was sentenced to death by the electric chair, and he was immediately taken to Sing Sing prison in New York, and by 11:15 he was executed by 1,820 volts of core electric passing through his body. Carl Wagenborn was pronounced dead on the 27th of April in 1896. But hold on, because there's much more to this case. New facts were discovered in 2021 by a London criminal specialist, PC Detective Trevor Marrett, and his findings are shocking. PC Detective Trevor Marrett also discovered that there was an underground thriving trade in origin and body parts in the late 21st century leading overseas to America. PC Trevor also discovered that Carl Wagenborn was also a shipping merchant by trade, working for a German shipping company called the Norderhoi Chon Lloyd. These big ships would bring much needed supplies from America into the profit system of the UK economy. Historic shipping reports show that the Norderhoi ship was actually docked in London and less than 15 minutes walk away from Whitechapel. These reports show that the ship was docked in London's harbour, matching up perfectly to the dates and times of the horrifying murders that took place in Whitechapel, 1888. What's even more compelling is Carl Wagenborn was actually listed as a crew member on that ship. So, was he Jack the Ripper? Aaron Kosminski was a Polish hair barber who worked within the Whitechapel area. The police back then believed him indeed to be responsible for the murders in London, because Aaron had psychopathic tendencies, and he also had a really strong hatred towards women, and he wasn't shy in making that known publicly by threatening and screaming and shouting at women as they walked past him in the Whitechapel streets. And as for why he didn't like women, nobody really knows why he didn't like women for sure, but he hated them. But Aaron did also suffer with homicidal tendencies as well, and because of these twisted tendencies he was experiencing, the doctors and police have little to no choice whatsoever to submit Aaron into a London mental asylum, not just once or twice, but on many occasions. Aaron passed away at age 53. But that's not all there is on this very complex and suspicious suspect, because in the year of 2014 and again in 2019, scientists from the University of Leeds and Liverpool, David Miller and Jerry Lee Howman, they both teamed up together scientifically to prove once and for all who Jack the Ripper was. By using this new microscopic DNA testing, they were able to extract microscopic blood cells and spit cells from the shore worn by Jack the Ripper's victim, Catherine Eddowes. Not long after the microscopic DNA testing was complete, both universities would sit back and await the results. And surprise, surprise, because both DNA tests came back matching that of Aaron Kosminski and Catherine Eddowes. Scientists from both universities were successful in being able to match the DNA with the living descendants of the Kosminski family with a 93.8% DNA match. So there you go, 2 scientists from 2 different cities, Liverpool and Leeds, pretty much confirming that Aaron Kosminski was indeed Jack the Ripper. So there we have it, Jack the Ripper, case finally closed and solved, right? Well, scientifically yes, but for some police officers, they still say no. And here's why. The historic police reports show that there was never an item ever listed as saved back then by the police in 1888 in connection with the Catherine Eddowes murder. And so some members of the London police force, even to this very day, still argue over the authenticity and the origin of the shore. And they're also somewhat sceptical about the DNA claims as well, purely on the grounds that the shore wasn't actually saved in the criminal archives of the police, and therefore any DNA contamination was likely to be quite high. However, the history of the shore does date back all the way to the Scotland Yard police officer Amos Simpson, who was one of the first officers on the scene at Catherine Eddowes' murder. He quickly realised that this was going to be a huge, massive, famous murder scene because it was a Jack the Ripper murder, and so the Scotland Yard detective then took the shore from the body of Catherine Eddowes and kept it within his family. The shore, along with its history, was then handed down the family lines until it was eventually owned by a David Melvin Hayes, who then in 1993 loaned the shore out to the Scotland Yard Museum for a really high price, and so the police then had the Shore on display in the police museum for around 14 years, and back then they were claiming the Shore to be authentic. Then years later in 2007, a very wealthy person named Russell Edwards bought the Shore in auction for around £3 million, who then had the Shoal DNA tested twice. Both results came back as a match, and the rest you already know now. So who was Jack the Ripper? Maybe Jack the Ripper was aka Leather Apron. He hated women and prostitutes, and he was always dressed ready for the kill. He openly said he wants to rip apart prostitutes, and was arrested for that statement. Maybe Jack the Ripper was Carl Fagenborn, a menacing psychopath with connections to an illegal underground body parts trafficking trade, and a self-confessed killer to the Whitechapel murders. Even his own family and lawyer believed that he was the killer. Or maybe it was Aaron Kosminski, a known psychopath who lived in the Whitechapel area. He had a real hatred for women and prostitutes, and convinced the police at the time that he was the Ripper, earning him a one-way ticket to an insane asylum. At first, our team here at When Evil Follows, we all believed that the murderer was Carl Fagenborn, because everything about him just seemed to scream Jack the Ripper, a proven psychopath who's already killed people, the underground body parts trade. The ship docking times matched that of the murders to the dates. So yeah, we all here pretty much were convinced that the killer was Carl Fagenborn. However, Aaron Kosminski has always been the police's #1 suspect at the time of the horrific murders. He was a hair barber, he had access to very sharp knives, and he hated women. He had psychopathic tendencies, knew the streets well, and was good at evading capture and detection. Until now, with DNA being found on the victim's shore, including saliva and blood, matching that scientifically to Aaron Kosminski. For us, here at the When Evil Follows, the DNA evidence pretty much makes the case closed, game, set and match. You know, science is amazing. The new DNA profile matching can even tell scientists what colour hair and eyes the killer had. And I can tell you now that colour was brown. And that's really crazy. And creepy to know. Hello there, and thank you so much for watching another episode of When Evil Follows. If you have enjoyed this episode, then please hit the like button and share with friends and family. And if you're new around here, subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss out on any of our amazing up and coming videos, just like this one. So which one of our top 3 do you think Jack the Ripper was? Maybe you believe Jack the Ripper to be someone entirely different. Either way, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always, please stay safe, look after yourself, and I'll see you again the next time When Evil Follows. Bye.